Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. The two supreme qualities of a Buddha are wisdom and compassion, karuna and panya. So these are two faculties that we as practitioners should be striving to develop at all times. And it's another case, as there are many in the various lists, it's a case of balance and having the two factors in harmony. Wisdom, panya, is different from knowledge, vidya. Panya is a deeper understanding, a real understanding of things that comes from experience and from direct seeing. Wisdom is defined as seeing things according to reality and not otherwise. So seeing the real nature of phenomena. The Visuddhimagga has a section on knowledge in which it opens with the statement that knowledge is the soil from which wisdom grows. So knowledge we can accumulate from external sources. We can accumulate knowledge from reading and listening and study of various kinds. But this is still not understanding. If knowledge is grasped wrongly, it can even become a hindrance to wisdom. There's always a danger in the spiritual life of thinking you've got something figured out. This is something always to be on guard against. You think you have some aspect figured out, particularly if you know the names in Sanskrit or Thai or Pali, then you think, oh, I really know it now. And when you take that attitude that you've got something figured out, it's like you put it away in its pigeonhole and you're blocking off any further growth in that area. No? It's always better to have an open mind that's ready for new experience and new information. And it's generally more useful to have a clearly formulated question than it is to find the answer. So wisdom is something that's built up over time through direct experience. And there are different kinds or grades of wisdom. There's a worldly wisdom that we all develop in our lives. As we go through our lives, we learn different life skills and practical skills and relationship skills and social skills. And this is all an accumulation, a slow accumulation of wisdom over the years. The spiritual wisdom is the profound understanding of actual reality, which we develop through mindfulness, through sati, through being present. And the formal practice of vipassana is a means of approaching that. But at any time when our mind is clear and we're looking at things in a realist fashion, then we're developing wisdom. This is sometimes difficult to do because we have a tendency to see things on a more abstract level. This is another variation of that same idea of having things figured out. We use shortcuts, we use some symbols in the mind to abstract or distance ourselves from the actual reality. Whereas with development of mindfulness and practice of vipassana, we should be trying to get always closer to the actual nuts and bolts, the bedrock of experience. What's the actual immediate experience in the here and now, not an abstraction about it, not telling a story about it, not analyzing it, but what is the mind experiencing at this moment right now. So an important skill to develop in that regard is precision of clarity of noticing, that we're noticing objects specifically. Another important skill is equanimity, the deep equanimity of being neutral towards whatever object arises. So not being swayed from a center point by objects that impinge on consciousness, but remaining steady and clear. As we notice the objects with more and more clarity and from a basis of equanimity, then we notice both the aspects in which they're different from one another and the aspects in which they're the same. The aspects in which they're different from one another is the discriminating wisdom. So we can discriminate between a physical sensation and a mental process. We can discriminate between thought formation of the past and the thought formation of the future, and so on. We're discriminating the particular aspects of an object. The other aspect, which actually cuts deeper, is noticing the wisdom of equality, or the equalizing wisdom, noticing the underlying sameness of all objects. All sankharas, all conditioned objects have the three characteristics of dukkha, anicca, anatta: suffering or imperfection or unsatisfactoriness, impermanence, and emptiness or not self. And it's particularly this last that's most important for the unfolding of wisdom, is noticing the emptiness of phenomena. Noticing the non-personal nature of the processes. And this is wisdom. But wisdom developed without compassion can become very sterile and even hard-hearted, or even fading into cruelty in the mind without balancing it with compassion. Because if we're seeing things always in the light of the ultimate dhammas of emptiness, then it can lead a person to be very disconnected and unconcerned and indifferent to the suffering of oneself or others. This is where compassion is needed as the balancing factor. And the wisdom and the compassion of the Buddha were both perfect and infinite. An extreme example from history of wisdom without compassion was the justification some Japanese samurai used, that taking the emptiness teachings from Zen, they said when we run somebody through with a sword, we're not doing anything other than moving atoms, empty atoms through empty space. There's no self doing it and no self suffering the results. So it's okay. We can just massacre Nanking as much as we want. This is an extreme example, and I don't think too many people would fall into that way of thinking, but there's a tendency in that direction of a spiritual failing to watch for is this kind of cold-heartedness, a kind of inner ruthlessness that can come with if compassion is not present. Compassion is the spiritual quality defined as the aspiration to end suffering. That's for self and others, to universally end suffering. It's very important, first of all, to understand exactly what's meant by karuna, because the translation compassion can be somewhat misleading. It's close, but compassion has a connotation that's not appropriate. In that compassion, the English word compassion comes from Latin roots meaning to suffer with. And karuna doesn't mean vicarious suffering. It's said that a test for, this is from the Sudimagga, test for the validity of karuna, if it's real karuna or not, is if it manifests as a diminution, it should lead to a diminution of cruelty or harming, ahimsa. It should lead to the mind moving away from that. And if it's a false karuna, it leads to suffering. And this is something that is really important to watch for, because suffering is real and it's universal. And the whole goal of the Buddhist path is the elimination of suffering. There's one way of defining it, the end of suffering. So we don't want to practice something that will increase the suffering in the world. So if our mind is aware or dwells on a being in suffering, compassion would, in the Buddhist sense, would be arousing of a sense of wishing to alleviate the suffering, but it wouldn't be vicarious suffering, which is something very, it's not really very obvious, and it can be challenging or difficult. We see somebody in suffering and then it makes us feel sad. That's not genuine karuna. Karuna should be an earnest wish or an aspiration that the suffering be ended. So that's the first thing about karuna. It's very important to understand what it means. And this aspiration can remain entirely at the level of the mind, as when one is, say, practicing meditation, karuna, as a brahmavihara, and developing compassion in that way. It's entirely in the mind. But in the activities of the life, compassion can motivate a being to action in the world, to try and relieve the suffering of others. And compassion, to be really liberating, it needs to be universal. It's not spiritually advanced to play favorites and only have compassion for certain beings or certain classes of beings and not others. People have compassion for animals, but they just have compassion only for the cute ones. They don't have compassion for scorpions and bed bugs. And that's not universal compassion. And in that same regard, it's also very important that we don't exclude ourselves. We have to have compassion for ourselves, not any less or any more than for other beings. This is part of the practice, that we have our own well-being in mind, and we actually have to start there. Have to, for any of the Brahmaviharas, you have to begin with yourself. May I be well and happy, may I be free from suffering. If you don't have loving kindness and compassion towards yourself, genuinely, deeply, fully, then it's impossible for you to really have it for anybody else. And if you do have it fully for yourself, then it's impossible to just stop there, because it's too powerful a force to be held in such a narrow vessel. It'll naturally expand to other beings. If you first have to love yourself, this is important to say and to take on, because many people have a kind of an idea or ethic of self-sacrifice all the time, and they make themselves suffer for the benefit of others, and that's not always genuine compassion. You have to have concern for your own well-being as a starting point, and not that you value yourself above others, but on the same plane. You keep your own well-being in mind. And compassion without wisdom is also a problem. That we can be moved by compassion to take unwise actions. If there's no guidance or restraint from wisdom, then compassion can actually lead to more suffering. We act unskillfully in an attempt to help others alleviate suffering, and there's an overwhelming urge to do something. And the first thing that wisdom needs to look at is it actually possible for me to do something in this case to help? Or would my meddling just make things worse? And it might be the case that the wise thing to do is to do nothing, to retain a feeling of compassion, but to let the situation unfold on its own. In other cases, wisdom will see, yes, I can do this or that. This is within my power. This is within my resources. I can help in this way. And then you can allow the motivation of compassion to cause you to take action and help beings. But without the guidance of wisdom, we, as often as not, we just make matters worse. The compassion by itself is not necessarily wise. It's a pure-hearted impulse, but it needs the guidance and restraint of wisdom. Just as wisdom by itself is sterile and cold, compassion by itself is unrestrained and kind of impulsive. So the two need to be balanced together. They come together in the end, when in their perfection, the difference between them dissolves. Someone who's fully wise, like a Buddha, would be fully aware of the suffering in the world and would be fully compassionate. And someone who's fully compassionate, like the Buddha, and wishes to make an end of suffering completely, this itself is an expression of wisdom. So the two come together in the end. But they are balancing factors, and they're essentially complementary. You need to work together to develop both of them. Different approaches can emphasize one over the other. I think a lot of the Theravada teachings are more wisdom-oriented. Certainly Abhidhamma, dependent origination, Vipassana practice, these are all kind of wisdom teachings. We balance them with heart practices like the Brahma Viharas and puja, chanting and honoring the Buddha. These are balancing practices. Some of the Mahayana probably emphasizes compassion more. They make compassion into a very central theme of the teaching. There's, for example, a story from Tibetan tradition. It's one of those extreme stories. Is I think it was Tilopa, someone in that lineage, was, in his early days, he was practicing meditation on Avalokiteshvara, who is the bodhisattva of compassion. It's like the personification of compassion. And he earnestly wished to be able to fully visualize Avalokiteshvara. And the years of practice, and he couldn't get it. And then he's walking down the road one day and he sees a dog, a wounded dog lying beside the road, whimpering. He goes up to examine it and it's got a big cut in its leg. And he wants to help the dog. He looks at the cut, it's all swarming with maggots. So he starts picking the maggots out. But then he realizes that, he's just dropping them on the ground. They're dying right away, so that's not good. So he takes his knife and cuts a slice in his own leg and starts putting the maggots in there. But then he's finding it difficult to pick the maggots without hurting them. So he has to think of a way to extract them more gently. So he leans his face down. He's going to take the maggots out with his tongue. He leans his face down into this pus-covered wound on the leg of a dog. And as soon as his tongue touches the wound, the dog transforms and turns into Avalokiteshvara. So this kind of thing is found often in Mahayana. And sometimes as a Theravadan, sometimes I find the emphasis on compassion can be excessive and lacking in wisdom. And I'm thinking particularly of their approach to ethics, where compassion trumps the precepts. So you can break a precept out of compassion. I am very cautious of that approach. I think it's dodgy. If a being was completely, if you were a very advanced bodhisattva, fully, extremely wise, you might be able to do that. But for most people, it's going to leave a door open for immoral behavior. You can make a justification in your mind. This is for the greater good. This is more compassionate. That's my Theravada kind of critique of that. But in the Mahayana view, compassion is a supreme virtue, and it's like a trump card that beats any kind of precept or any ethical concern. And it's just another example of how subtle and difficult it can be to balance wisdom and compassion and keep them both working together, to have wise compassion and compassionate wisdom. The Tibetans have interesting teachings around wisdom and compassion, as they emphasize the pairing, and they use, as they often do in their teachings, they use gender symbolism. And the interesting facet of that is that compassion is considered to be the male principle, and wisdom is the female principle. And this is the external symbolism of this is the bell and the dorje. And I just often see Tibetan in rituals, they will use a bell in one hand, and you know what a dorje is? It's this brass lightning bolt, right? And they have a bell and a dorje. The bell is like the womb, which is the empty space is the important part, and it's the like the full emptiness, the potentiality of the void, which is potential of all things. But by itself, it's barren. It's truly empty. It's without any effect or consequence. It needs to be fertilized by the flash of enlightenment, which is the dorje, the lightning bolt, which by itself is sterile, is useless, but entering into the full emptiness of the void, and it creates all manifestation, and it's the essence of full awakening. And so this is compassion and wisdom. The lightning flash of compassion, which is essentially a self-sacrificing action, just entering the void, entering into annihilation, basically. And the void is the wisdom, is all potential, but it's cold and sterile and barren by just on its own without that flash of compassion. So these are two opposite but complementary, harmonious qualities. And we should endeavor to let them inform and temper each other so that the wisdom doesn't become just barren, unproductive, cold, useless simulation of wisdom, which might have some understanding, but it's not productive of full awakening, and it's certainly useless for anything in the world. Or compassion not informed by wisdom, which is just emotional excess, and by itself is not productive of useful results in the world. It's not spiritually productive, and it's not helpful in the world if we just have compassion without any wisdom. We just either end up burning ourselves out trying to help where it's impossible, or we end up, out of a blind impulse to do something, we end up making matters worse. Internally, just as a spiritual quality, the development of wisdom or the Brahma-viharas can lead one into deep, blissful jhana states, but they don't lead out of samsara. They don't, by themselves, lead to liberation. Wisdom is required for that. So, I think that's enough of this topic for now.
And Ramayam, Dhammakataya, Sadhu Karam, Dharamase, Sadhu, Sadhu, Sadhu.